Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Episode 14 of the Paul Street Journal. We have made it to the last episode of this season. We haven't really expressed very clearly what the season layout is going to look like all throughout the podcast, but you a couple of times threw in last episode that this is season 1, and what season 1 is and what it's been is kind of like the background, the context, the philosophical, what other words would we use to describe what season 1 has been? Philosophical, maybe historical.
We did the biblical, then the historical, and then the philosophical.
Right. So that's what season 1 has been, and season 1 is coming to a close with this episode. And then I'll speak a little bit later about what season 2 is going to look like. But the last episode of season 1 is going to be about fascism, which I commented on last episode. And I think that our listeners don't need to be convinced not to be fascists. I would think that most people are on the same page that fascism is blatantly wrong. But we're going to talk about it. We're going to say maybe why so, or what fascism is, and why it's not Christian. And hopefully that if there are any of you that need convincing, maybe we can convince you, but I really doubt it. But yeah, let's get started. Fascism.
Yeah.
Where do we start?
I don't think fascism is as clearly articulated and defined as the others. Like, we have those foundational documents for capitalism, the Wealth of Nations, for communism, the Communist Manifesto, and for all different types of nuanced socialistic systems, which we didn't mention in detail, but we did talk about how they came to be and describe some of the nuances of non-communist socialistic economic paths to take. So fascism not having that foundational documentation, it certainly has been tried historically, and it seemed to rise and fall quickly for a number of reasons. But let's go through it. Because I don't think we have many listeners who lean in this direction. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this. We can fly through it and then wrap up this first season, introduce the next season.
Right. Okay. I also think I would agree that fascism is probably less
enticing.
That one, and then 2, maybe harder to define, or because there's like you say, there's not this text that says this is what we're advocating for, but I think it's more so described, or the way that it's been tried or implemented is described by like maybe characteristics that fascism has or that fascist rulers had, and that perhaps we will cover. But just so people do know that we're not trying to define fascism, because it's probably not, like you say, not easy to articulate. But this is also maybe perhaps a review of the philosophies that are perhaps leading toward it, that do lead to fascism or had led to fascism. So yeah, let's jump in.
Well, to start, we should talk about the word. And this isn't in our notes, but if you study the word, its root is in, if you have like one stick, and you could just easily break it. But if you put a bunch of sticks together, it becomes harder. So there's this whole idea of like multiple individuals. If there's enough of them, they become this unbreakable force, right?
And that's the Latin word is the sticks. It comes from a Latin word.
Yeah.
And it's like a bundle of sticks.
Yes.
It's kind of funny, but
yeah. And it makes sense. I mean, like the visual it's clear, right?
Yeah.
And we've all tried that. It does work, right? Yeah. But the implications politically are intense, because what this really meant to like Mussolini, for example, is a one-party state. So his argument would be like, if there's multiple parties battling within a state, that leads to disunity, not unity. The only way that country is going to be able to survive in a competition of many countries is if everybody in particular country is unified on the same page, working for the same goals with the same mission, right? And that mission be nationalistic, right? So that one party state is one of the primary aspects or characteristics of fascism.
Yeah. I think I also want to point out is that we mentioned that communism was also reactionary and that it wasn't this, it was meant for a time and a place reacting to the errors or the consequences of capitalism. And I do think that Mussolini or other fascists were responding to something. I don't think that they were making some claim to this has always been the perfect system that is what we need to implement. It's more so, I think, was a reaction, like you say, to this competition. By the time Mussolini is calling for this one-party state, you know, it's at a time in history where there's war and there are these nations already. So it is contextualized, I think, in that.
Mussolini, his argument for that one-party system and that unity and that nationalism, which is a very militaristic nationalism. That's another characteristic of fascism is militarism, nationalistic militarism, to be specific. It's a response to World War I and how the concept of total war came into being. So before World War I, I think the general concept of war was like the warriors fight the warriors. But in World War I, like entire nations were put behind the war effort, even like women. And there was a lot of civilian casualties, which you don't hear about a lot in World War I, but it happened. So this whole idea of total war leads to a guy like Mussolini thinking, okay, it can't just be like the military. It's got to be the whole nation of Italy that is behind the militaristic efforts of the nations.
Right.
It's a very different way of thinking.
Yeah. I also maybe want to point out that because fascism is, the definition of it hasn't been well articulated, or there's not this claim, like we said, we're characterizing it. Because I think I have read or heard it argued that, you know, fascism, if we're talking about the theory of fascism, it doesn't have to be militaristic or have to be nationalistic, but some people, maybe this is like a fascist at heart, would say that, you know, fascism is putting the group over the individual fully. Like that is, you know, at heart fascism, and then you use whatever means to get there. And in history, it's been this militaristic, nationalistic. But again, just an idea. Well,
I'm glad you mentioned that. So this idea of the nation being above the individual, that shows that it's a reaction, a response to socialism, and in some ways an agreement with that component of socialism. Fascism will take components of both communism and socialism and capitalism and integrate it into its own understanding of things. And one of the ways in which fascism and socialism are connected is even in the name. Like Hitler's party name was the Nazi Party, which was the National Socialistic Party, right? So even the word socialism is in Nazi, and Hitler would have been totally against communism, totally against capitalism, right? But he didn't find the word socialism to be so problematic.
Yeah. Okay. I think what I hoped to point out was maybe like fascism's goal, and then suggest that militarism or nationalism or maybe tools, or also maybe embedded in fascism, but like tools to get to that goal of it's this group over the individual and it's us versus them, which we mentioned about communism. I think that perhaps can give clarity. Like, this is what fascism was striving for. They didn't, I hope not just want to like kill everyone that disagreed and like make sure everyone's on the same team. It's like, what we want to do is build this one unified party and state, and any means necessary, I guess, is how they were thinking about that.
Yeah, so there's certainly a utilitarian component to fascism. And one of the main purposes and goals of fascism is in the context. It could only be known and understood in the context of social Darwinism. So, you know, Darwin has his scientific evolutionary survival of the fittest theory. Then there's the context of World War I. So there's the militaristic background, there's the scientific background, then there's the economic background, which is capitalism and different types of socialism being promoted. So fascism is a response and integration, a rejection of all of these things, which are all products of the Enlightenment, right? So the social Darwinism is this idea of, okay, there's all these countries in the world. There's all these states. Some are better than others, and it's a survival of the fittest situation. So the only nations that are going to make it in a total war environment are the ones that are unified, the ones that are powerful. There are fascists who will say in the 20th century, war is beautiful, right? And most of the fascist ideologues did not believe in a welfare system at all, because that is helping the weak, right? So we could see how this is starting to get clearly far apart from the Christian understanding of things, right? Because people who are disabled or old or who don't fit into the nationalistic ideal, there's just no place for them.
Yeah.
Right? So within the nation, getting rid of the weak, getting rid of those who aren't compliant for the sake of overpowering and winning against other nations. That's the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you connected to social Darwinism, because it highlights, I think, very well the desire for fascist countries to be this strong, heavy-handed, and capable of surviving, not weak. And I think that's deeply connected to this idea of survival of the fittest, and it's kind of magnified or expanded to the state level, like you mentioned. And I think that's a great connection. Yeah.
And I hate to mention Nietzsche, but we have Darwin, who is the scientific, like, biological survival of the fittest. But Nietzsche, the philosopher, he says, okay, like, if God is dead, right? And he's not necessarily an atheist, but he says, like, if God is dead, if society killed him, which of course we don't believe, right? But if that's the case, then the whole moral system connected to the Judeo-Christian principles is gone. We have to start from scratch. And the only people who are going to win are the powerful.
Right.
So power and strength is what is good. And weakness is bad.
Yeah.
Weak should be eradicated. Powerful should be encouraged.
Yeah.
So there's there's so much background to this.
Yeah.
And guess what Hitler gave Mussolini for his birthday? Just the collected works of Nietzsche.
Yeah. I don't want to spend too much time on Nietzsche, but I do think, like you said, there's a lot of influence from him, and maybe like part of it is this attitude of not being okay with being weak. Like, weakness is terrible. You must be strong.
And I don't think Nietzsche would agree with Mussolini and Hitler, but
yeah,
he certainly was an influence for Hitler and Mussolini.
Right. And I think that's worth mentioning, pointing out. And Nietzsche also had a very great mustache, but that's
lots of extreme facial hair among the political and economic scientists at that time.
But that's all I want to say about him. So let's continue.
Okay, so I kind of already mentioned this concept of direct action. It's this idea of legitimizing violence for the sake of a greater good. So we talked about the role of violence in Christianity and Catholicism, and God's revelation to humanity has evolved, and it comes to a culmination in Jesus, who helps teach the world that nonviolence is not only possible, but the best. And even moments of Catholicism, there's been this like unhealthy attachment to violence, but there is no scruple whatsoever in fascism about the use of violence, even for creating national unity or for empowering a nation over another, right? So direct action, meaning violence is okay, and it's often necessary. Another characteristic: government control over the economy. So is fascism against private property? No. Private property is fine as long as it is utilized for the sake of the nation. So there's a nuance there. And is the market free? No, really, the government's in charge, but there's still the opportunity for private property. So there's a mix there between capitalism, which allows private property, and socialism, which has government control.
Yeah, I think one trend that I've perhaps noticed at this point is, I think in fascism there is this like ultimate good, which is the well-being of the nation. However, it's been defined by these people. But it does seem like there's not, like we've already mentioned, there's not this well-defined system of what fascism is supposed to look like. But it's like there's this ultimate good, and there's this balancing act of figuring out how we're going to get there. But what fascism is okay with is this violence, or encouraging this violence. And I think that's what perhaps this episode is doing, pointing out the things that fascism was striving to do What are the things that they used to get there, and what were they okay with? And a lot of the things that they used to get there and were okay with seem very unchristian already.
Oh my gosh.
But I perhaps that's what the trend that I've been noticing. So they're probably fascists. Were probably okay with some blend of capitalist ideologies and communist ideologies or goals, but for the sake of their ultimate good, which was, the well-being of the nation, the nation's interests, which is hard to define, but that's what it seemed like they were trying to do.
Yeah. I'm with you. And I was going to say this later, but based off of what you said, this is a good time to mention that fascism it's a European counter current against like that old European humanist movement with beautiful, intricate art and opulence, right? Like just compare like a Gothic cathedral or a Baroque cathedral to a structure created under a fascist regime, which is like stark, boxy, simple, like that modernist architecture of minimalism, right? Is it has that connection to the modernist movement of within fascism. Everything is very utilitarian. Like, what is its use in power?
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's a good point.
Don't worry about beauty. War is beauty, right?
Yeah. Right? No, I think that's well said.
All right, so the whole idea of government control of the economy, that's obviously against subsidiarity, localism. There's this concept of total self-dependency as a country. So this is an anti-globalism way of thinking. So capitalism is very pro-globalism. You mine a raw material in one country, it's then processed and it's turned into a product and manufactured in another country, then it's sold in another country. So this is very different. It's an anti-dependency on other nations for raw materials, the production of goods.
Yeah, it's like the identity politic, us versus them thing we mentioned last episode.
Right, and if you as a nation are seeing other nations as enemies, which is a foundational component here, it's an underlying assumption of fascism. I mean, you can't be dependent for oil, for example, on your enemy. You need to be able to produce your own oil. So fascism, it understands the need for social classes, for like the strata, or the hierarchy of classes, and it promotes a very clear definition in the order of hierarchy. So don't beat around the bush. Don't have those soft edges between classes. There's an upper class, a middle class, a lower class. You know your place. Very clear line of authoritative structure. That's part of the system.
Yeah, I see.
And it reflects what you would see in a military. So just extend the power structure of any military, even the United States military, and just apply that to everybody is what.
Yeah,
that's the concept.
Clear, rigid lines between the. Okay, so why are we discussing fascism in our economics-focused podcast? Like, this feels less economic than communism, but I'm sure it's still economic. But I think it says less, and maybe this is because fascism hasn't been articulated specifically by one person, but it almost feels as though the economics is almost irrelevant. It's just like, we want this power, and if it's militaristic and nationalistic, we are okay with whatever economic system comes around, as long as we have this. That's what it sounds like fascism or fascists were striving for. But
yeah, I mean,
maybe that's too reductionist to think. So, how is this economic in any way?
It's just so different and stark from capitalism. So in capitalism, we have all these, it's like hyper-individualism. Everybody's working towards their own good, and perhaps somehow that helps the common good. So individuals seeking their own benefit, that's the capitalistic society. What you see in the fascist society is, in many ways, it's the opposite. Yes, there's the private property, but everything is directed towards that communal national power. So it might not be obvious that it's economical because it's so national, but everything is put towards the power of the nation, including the economy.
I see. Yeah.
Social welfare, it's not encouraged. Now, did social welfare happen under these fascist regimes? Yes, but it wasn't considered a good thing.
Okay. So let's say there's this ultra-militaristic, nationalistic state. What does the state look like? Like, I'm sure if there's some sort of social welfare system,
Mm-hmm.
I hope it's not like a soldier coming to your door and be like, pay me your taxes or whatever. But was there this body of like administrative state that was, you know?
Yeah, there was an administrative state. Okay. And, you know, there's so much good literature about this, like how the administrative state worked under these regimes. And fascism didn't last long. You know, it's relegated to just a tiny portion of human history. So there isn't a large sample of this. But how these systems worked, it is documented. It is interesting. These dictators, whether it's for a fascist environment or any other environment, like it's an interesting study on how to not manage people. Like it could be like a Harvard business study on what not to do.
Yeah.
But basically, these fascist dictators, they would very rarely have this idea in their head, this goal, and then share it broadly. They would try to separate the people that reported to them and have them compete against each other. So there was this hyper-competitive environment. It goes back to the social Darwinism. But they wanted, the people in charge counted on the people below them, fighting with them among one another. So oftentimes, a person in the military wouldn't know what a person in the economics environment would be doing. And everything was very like siloed and segregated so that the person in charge was always in power, even from a mission and goal perspective.
Okay.
Does that
No, I think that does make sense. And it's important, I think, to say that it is short-lived. Fascism was short-lived, perhaps in practice, but I think it's kind of clear where the problems lie and how where it's unchristian. But like we've said before that it's a balance between the individual and the common good. But fascism just tends very totally to the common good or the nation. And I think that's the big problem we're trying to focus on and highlight.
I agreed with everything you just said. And I don't know this, and maybe some of our listeners would know if they've done some reading about this. But I wonder how influenced Hitler and Mussolini were how influenced they were of Napoleon. You know, Napoleon, in many ways, just, you know, was a conqueror, felt the same way. And the people of France, for Napoleon, they were just a means to his own conquest.
Yeah,
right?
That's a good question.
The young men growing up in French rural farms, they were just used as like cannon fodder. Yeah. You know, total affront to the dignity of individual human beings.
Right. Yeah, and it does seem like an echo of that kind of attitude. So I think it is a great question to consider. So again, I think reiterated throughout the whole episode, fascism is bad. I hope we convinced those of you who needed convincing. But it is the end of our season 1, episode 14 is the end. And again, to reiterate, it was the biblical, then the historical, then the philosophical, and kind of contextual, I guess, is the word I've really been thinking of, because it's laying the groundwork for the seasons to come. So then the next season, season 2, is going to be the ecclesial or the doctrinal, perhaps. And what we're going to highlight and focus on is Catholic social teaching, and specifically the magisterial response to economics or to these systems. To put this, I guess, in simple terms, we're probably going to follow the papal encyclicals, starting with Rerum Novarum, which is the thing that I didn't want to spoil throughout this entire first season. But Rerum Novarum is, I think, where we're starting. And it's generally where the start to the Catholic social teaching on economic lies. And we've read one of Pope Leo XIII's encyclicals before. We read Libertas in response to some of the philosophical things we were talking about here. But Rerum Novarum is where we're really getting into the economic in a clearer way than what we've been able to discuss in the first season. And I'm excited. I think that's going to be perhaps some of it's going to be maybe clear what Catholics are supposed to think. Why are we supposed to think the way we think about economics? Why is a Pope even talking about economics, I guess? I hope that those questions are ones that we consider and try to answer and try to wrestle with. And to be clear, you know, we're going to do our best, Brian and I, at presenting you with what the popes have taught and guided us to know, but it's going to be our best effort. And the best thing to do is to listen to the popes themselves and read the texts. But we want to make it comprehensive. We want to make it digestible. And we want to discuss it and kind of bounce back and forth and connect things ourselves. So that's what season 2 will look like. Do you have any thoughts about season 1 ending or season 2 starting?
Yeah, I think that season 1 could have come across as unnecessary. We could have maybe started with Rerum Novarum, and what does the church have to say? What is the Catholic doctrine on Catholic social teaching and economics? But I remember as a young man reading, I was in my 20s, and I read Rerum Novarum, and I was perplexed because I didn't have the context. And I'll tell you what, like, Rerum Novarum comes alive, and it makes so much sense if you understand the biblical foundations, the historical context, the philosophical movements, all of the philosophical origins of the isms, those economic isms, capitalism, socialism, communism. So knowing all of these things makes these encyclicals come alive. And each of these encyclicals we're going to go over are written for a particular time. So if we were to read Rerum Novarum and then just stop, that would be a 130-year outdated way of thinking. Right? Rerum Novarum is such a unique encyclical. Think about how many encyclicals are named after other encyclicals. Very few. It's just with the Catholic social teaching encyclicals that we have this like line of teaching for over the course of several papacies, over the course of over 100 years. So the second encyclical is named after the first. The third is named after the first, right? Even Centesimus Annus, written by John Paul II, is written 100 years after Rerum Novarum, right? So this line of teaching of the popes is just very unique in and of itself. And we're gonna talk about what is an encyclical, where in the line of authority does an encyclical lie, how bound we are as Catholics to the content of encyclicals. What's the difference between dogma and doctrine, and what a pope says on an airplane in some backhanded comment, right? We're gonna line all those things up and say, okay, well, what are we bound to as Catholics? It's going to be exciting. If you care about what the church has to say, season 2 is going to be fun for you.
Oh yeah, and I think season 2. I think you point out very well that it's going to be this line that it starts with the Catholic social teaching, I guess, starts with Rerum Novarum. But it's not something new. It's a continuation of the Judeo-Christian principles. It's a continuation of the kenosis and the Christian response to economics. But Pope Leo is the one that, as you say, starts with that encyclical, and then that's when we start getting into doctrine and whatnot. But it's a continuation. It'll be a new season for us. We're going to have a different model and perhaps present differently the things that we're talking about. But it's a continuation, I think we would hope, from the beginning of this podcast to that moment. And I think it'll confirm maybe and echo some of the thoughts that we've already shared, us being perhaps informed by and using the Judeo-Christian principles. But it will be I think it will be insightful. It will feel refreshing. So yeah, overall, ecstatic, very excited to get there. But I do want to point out that it's a continuation. It's not this new thing. It is for its place in time, but it is a continuation of the Christian response or the Judeo-Christian economic life. And I think with that said, this wraps up season 1. It's been a good ride, and it's going to get even better next season. So thank you all. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Joe, for season 1. And thank the audience for listening to the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.